Bonsoir. I'm Sarah McIntyre, Manager of Board and Strategic Services at Ottawa Public Library, and it is my great pleasure to introduce this evening's event. Kwe Kakina. Hello, everyone. It's important to acknowledge that we are hosting this program this evening from the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. Many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people now live, work, and study in this territory. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Ottawa Reads YA this evening. This series brings you timely conversations with authors primarily active in YA literature. Each author visit is followed by a Q&A session, so have your questions ready and be ready to join in. Recent Ottawa Reads YA events are available for you to enjoy on OPL's Facebook page and our YouTube channel. Tonight, we are pleased to have with us author Tiffany D. Jackson in a moderated conversation with author Kate J. Met. Tiffany Jackson received her Bachelor of Arts in Film from Howard University and her Master of Arts in Media Studies from New School University. She currently resides in Atlanta, Georgia. Tiffany is an award-winning and New York Times bestselling author of several YA novels, including her latest book, White Smoke. White Smoke is a chilling YA psychological thriller and a modern take on the classic haunted house story, described as The Haunting of Hill House meets Get Out. White Smoke is available to borrow at OPL, and I encourage you to place a hold if you haven't already read it. In addition to writing novels, Tiffany has worked in TV and film for more than a decade. In 2009, she wrote and directed the short horror film, The Field Trip, receiving praise in the film festival circuit. You are in for some great advice from Tiffany as she discusses her writing process and experiences with you this evening. Our moderator for tonight's event is Kate J. Met, an Ottawa-based author and journalist. Kate began her career as a daily news reporter at the New Brunswick Telegraph-Journal after studying journalism and video production at Ryerson. Kate is the author of 8 books. Her first book in the Orca Sports series, Slam Dunk, was selected as a best book for kids and teens. Currently, she brings Canadian stories to life as features editor of Canada's History magazine. Let's get on with the conversation, which sounds like a match made in heaven for all of the writers and readers who are with us tonight. It's now my pleasure to pass on the mic to our moderator, Kate.
Thank you so much, and welcome, Tiffany, to virtual Ottawa.
Thank you for having me. A lovely introduction.
It was. Now that was the formal introduction, but I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourself a bit more informally. You know, where do you come from? Where are you going? Where are you at now? And how does this book fit into all that?
A little less formally, I am Tiffany D. Jackson. I go with the middle name because there's another Tiffany Jackson who plays in the WNBA, and people seem to find her more often than me. But I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. I currently live in Atlanta, Georgia, but I still have a bed in New York always because I can never leave home. Because Brooklyn, of course, is where I live. I've wanted to be an author since I was 4 years old. And so being in this position at this moment in time is incredibly, it's truly an honor and a blessing. So I'm really excited to be here, especially with my first horror. I grew up reading horror, so this is just who I am.
Excellent. So I just want to remind everyone out there, you can put your questions in the Q&A here at the bottom of the Zoom chat if you're in Zoom, or sorry, not the chat, the Q&A in Zoom. And if you're following us on Facebook, put your questions in the comment field and we will get to the questions at about 7:45. And if I see your question pop up, I will try not to ask Tiffany the same question. So you can still have your question. I'll do my best. We're going to talk about your book, Tiffany, but first of all, I'm just curious about your take on books in general, because I remember about, maybe 5-10 years ago, it was books were going to die, right? The kids weren't going to read books anymore. It was all going to be their device. And, people were just, and you actually are, in film as well. So you've written screenplays and you've written for film media. And yet here we are with a great big thick book on paper, a actual book with words in it. So what is it that you love about books, writing them, and why do you think people still love reading books?
I think first off, I love writing books mostly because I'm a storyteller by heart. I have a big, big imagination. I always have. I can always look into a room and just make up something just based off an object in the room, just make up a whole tale about it. And I used to be able to do that even when I was younger. So for me, this was a no-brainer in a sense. And somehow it seems a little easier than writing scripts, maybe because I'm a little long-winded. Scripts are maybe 10,000 words versus, our books are 80,000 words on a good day. So that's honestly where my love for books kind of come from. But I feel I do remember when everyone was really worried about oh, no one's going to read books anymore, blah, blah, blah. And I was you haven't picked up a good book. That's basically what happened. Because when you find a good book, it gets you into reading, you never stop. Absolutely. You never stop reading. So, and there's something to be said about books that draw you in and is a place for escape. And especially this last year and change during the pandemic, there was actually an uptick in reading because people had time to sit still and actually they wanted to escape. So where did they go? They went to books. There's only so much that you can get out of a film per se, but a book actually elicits a reaction out of all of your 5 senses without ever touching you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really true, actually. And how do you find it different writing a book from other than the length, okay, the word count, but apart from that, what for you is the difference between writing a screenplay or maybe a TV show versus writing a narrative form like a novel?
So I've never written a TV show. I've mostly stayed in the film aspects. But that said, it's almost like the opposite. In film, we have to tell exactly what's happening versus in books, we have to show what's happening. And, I still struggle with the show don't tell rule. Even, what is this, 5 books in, several books in, I still get that edit in my little edit letter. And I'm because I just want to say they went up the stairs versus describing the stairs, describing the door, describing, what she's smelling and, that kind of thing. So there are times where I struggle with that part of the writing process of remembering that, this isn't a film, that you actually have to describe every single thing a character is feeling and smelling and touching and tasting. And that was somewhat of a struggle for me. So even my first book, I think the word length was maybe 50,000 words. And when I actually went back and added all of the, the things that make it more of a book, it turned out to be 85K. And, there's something to be said about, describing what it's like, especially in a haunted house, describing all the eerie sounds and finding metaphors for what that eerie sounds feels like, because no one can actually hear it. You have to describe it to other people. Like crunching, when you first bite into a potato chip, what that sounds like, what that feels like you have to put all of those details in a book to make the book come alive.
Mm-hmm. Whereas in a film, you can lean on all of these creative collaborators, right? I mean, you've got a costume person who's going to come up with all the great costumes. You've got a lighting person, you've got a director, you've got these fantastic actors, you've got a makeup person, right? And all these people are going to bring their own expertise and their own creativity to it. Whereas with It's a Book, it's you, it's just you.
Yeah.
You're it.
Yeah, exactly. I love set designers, right? Because the way they think, they can really bring a whole world to life, or even graphic designers, the way they can animate things. Like the fact that their minds work that way. It's such, minute details. Like that's what I love about them, because they also bring, and they're the unsung heroes of most like film, because you look at a set and you just plop an actor in there and they take over, but that set is what makes make that character come alive. And so I think that that's, something to be said. I mean, I'm going on a tangent and giving them like so many like praise, but I think that is a part of what I sort of miss, because I now have to be the set designer in my own book versus someone else doing that for me. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. In that's right. Like it's all on you. And sometimes I find maybe it's in a way it's great because it's all your own imagination, it's your own vision. But then in a way, it's so great to have a creative collaboration with someone else who comes up with stuff that you maybe didn't think of. And and I'm just wondering, as a writer, so we don't get that with other people we're working with, but sometimes when you're doing school visits or talking to your fans, or maybe get fan letters or feedback, or even this kind of situation, like do you find that brings something to your creative process?
You mean talking to readers about?
Yeah, talking to readers, interacting with readers.
Yes, actually. Aside from getting so much love and so much like praise from readers, and even just especially, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I keep writing because of my readers. Like they are definitely like the bone behind my creative muscle, because honestly, I kind of came into this industry thinking I was only going to publish one book. Like that was it. Like I succeeded in my dream and poof, that was it. And I guess maybe I wasn't dreaming big enough. But the industry can be kind of tough sometimes too. There's a lot of rejection. There's a lot of just waiting. Yes, there's a lot to be said. And I remember I had a conversation with my friend Lori Halls Anderson, who basically told me that I need to start doing school visits, because then you remember who you're writing for. And that's exactly what I did. I wasn't doing school visits before then. And then I started doing school visits, and I got addicted to doing them because I get to talk to kids. And I get to kind of like pick their brains and see how, and everyone reads differently, right? So like just hearing their imagination, like what they feel like they're seeing. And it reminds me sort of like, I'm writing for them. I'm writing for like the young Tiffany's out there who were looking for these type of books when I was younger and didn't see myself on the page, or didn't see my type of story or who I wanted to be on the page.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So that brings me into, let's talk about your book. So horror, and you say you've loved horror your whole life. So I don't know, what is it? What's the draw with horror? Why is horror fascinating to you? And also, who were some of the horror writers that you read growing up?
So I think there's something about horror that feels familiar, that excitement, that rush, that adrenaline that I was surrounded by when I was younger, when I was growing up in Brooklyn. Like there was something to be said about, there was a real danger around a lot of times. And so somehow horror had that danger aspect, but I knew it was fake. Like I knew like some of the stuff couldn't really happen. So like I knew that like Jason and Freddie weren't real, but they felt real, and they felt that excitement. I love that adrenaline rush. And I particularly loved ghost stories. So when I was younger, I would always take this one book, Are You Afraid of the Dark, out of the library, like every time we went in there, every single time. And then finally, Scholastic Book Fair came to our school, and my teacher literally walked me over to the section and put the first Goosebumps book in my hands. And that was it. I was an R.L. Stine fan from that moment on. I think the first book that I read of his was Monster Blood. And it was exactly when he first came out. Like he was just with Scholastic. So I'm kind of aging myself there, but Like, I've been a fan since the beginning of the Goosebumps series. And, I went straight to Fear Street. I did a little Christopher Pike, who's a bit racier. And Mary as the, man, I'm blanking on a couple of other people's names.
Okay, now are you a Stephen King fan? This is a bit of a throwback, but classic.
No, I went, but this is a good point of the story, because I literally went from going to R.L. Stein and everyone straight to Stephen King. Like, there was no in between. So I actually grew up not reading young adult at all. I never had, because none of those books really spoke to me. I didn't have the same problems they did. So I went straight into the Stephen Kings, the James Pattersons, the Mary Higgins Clarks. Like, I went straight there from R.L. Stein. So I was reading Stephen King at like 12. So it's like slightly more advanced. Things are a bit more like, what's happening? I feel like if I was to ever go back and reread this entire catalog, I would have a whole different picture of what his books were about.
This is like R.L. Stein was your gateway drug, and then you went to the hard stuff, right? Like the really hard stuff. Well, okay, but tell our innocent little readers in Ottawa, what is it like? What was it like growing up in the Bronx? I'm curious, because you opened that door of danger.
Oh, Brooklyn. I grew up in Brooklyn.
Yeah, sorry, Brooklyn. I'm sorry, my mistake.
Yeah, no, it was Brooklyn in the 90s definitely we got hit pretty hard during the crack epidemic. And there was a lot of drugs and violence and protests, a lot of things changing around that time. New York itself was a little grimy back then, to say the least. And things were changing, but they were changing kind of slowly. And, growing up, like, you had to be sort of, alert and on your P's and Q's and making sure that you don't go to certain areas at night, especially, or during the day too. So there was something to be said about like every time we walked outside to just, be alert. Which of course, that's actually all city kids are told to be alert, to have that city instinct. Whenever they step outside of their comfort zone, their door. So that was sort of, but at the same time, even though I'm talking about all these things that sound really scary, we were also very much, a tight community. Like, Brooklynites really like bond together over like, a mutual hate of other boroughs. Or, we were diehard Knicks fans, even though we haven't won anything like in a very long time. We also have just the things that we love to do and celebrate and stuff. So even in the midst of troubled waters, we still have, love and friendship and family. So that was something that it balanced very much. It didn't always balance, but I still read as much scary stuff as possible.
So now you're saying that about Brooklyn, and now that's reminding me about the woods in your book. And I wasn't going to ask this till later in my little list of questions, but I feel you have to be flexible as an interviewer. So going with the flow, you talk about like in the book here, so it is a horror story, it is like a ghost story, it's about a haunted house, which we'll talk about in a sec, but it's set within a neighborhood. I mean, it is set very much, the setting I think is an important component of the story, and not just the setting of the house, but the setting of the town and the way that the town is divided between maybe the richer part of town, right, where all the hoo-has come from, and and they've got all their nice houses and everything, and then on the other side of the tracks, in a sense, right, the wood and the poverty and almost like these houses that have burnt down, that have never been rebuilt, like real urban decay in that situation. And the characters being bonded close together, I'm not going to say too much, by certain things that are in the book. But also there's a tension among the characters too. They're not all like, there's also, they're close to each other, but there's also wariness, I find, among like wariness to the outside, but also in some points wariness among each other too sometimes. So maybe you can just talk a little bit about how the setting and the social issues that you bring into the book, how does that sort of play together with the other part of the book, which is the ghost story and everything, and why is it important to you to bring those things? Do you think it was important for you to bring social issues, or is it just that when you sit down to write something, you're like, okay, this is what comes out because this is your experience, and you're not like deliberately saying, oh, I need to bring a social issue into this, right? It's just sort of, this is what's inside you that's coming out.
So, so White Smoke was inspired by two things. One, a haunting that happened in Japan a couple of years ago. I was really fascinated by this haunting, and I never forgot it. And then two, it was inspired by a trip I took to Detroit for the first time. Now, like I said, I'm from New York. We are so used to kind of living on top of each other, basically in small apartments and etc. But when I got to Detroit, it was the first time that I saw like literally blocks full of empty homes.
Yeah.
I had never seen anything like that. And I kept saying like, so these are just empty? No one's living here? For like rows and rows of houses, and a lot of them burnt down. And when I kept asking the question, because I was just fascinated by it, I kept getting a different answer. And then I landed on an urban legend about it. And then I kept like digging and digging. I started doing more research because, you know, I was just really sort of like confused. And there is something to be said about when you do research, especially in like these type of, you know, in cities like this, there's something very sinister that's actually at play. And I felt that that sinister aspect could make a really great villain / horror, you know, like tie in very well with horror. Because the act of, you know, plotting on someone's home, particularly in a lot of these gentrified areas, is sinister. It's very evil. And, you know, what is evil? When do we talk about evil? We talk about it in a horror aspect. So to me, I felt that that was like a great sort of tie-in with a haunting that I really wanted to write about, that I just couldn't find like, you know, a talisman to hold it to, and then stumbling upon the city of Detroit for the first time, which that was actually, when did I go there? I actually went the same year I went to Ottawa. I came to Ottawa that year, and then I also went to Detroit. So I like discovered all these new cities. I didn't even realize Detroit was so close to Canada that everyone has passports to go back and forth. Like, I didn't have a clue, because, you know, I was always in my little bubble.
Yeah.
Oh yes, it was back in 2018 when this happened, and that was my first visit to Detroit. And so I had been thinking about all those homes and sort of diving into it. But then it wasn't just Detroit. I had ended up going to a lot of different cities and finding the same situation where there'll be an area full of abandoned, deserted homes that, you know, some people live in, or, you know, left that way because developers want to leave it that way. They want the cities to look like that. So that way people will leave, and then they can come in and bulldoze it and make a whole different type of city. So I thought it was really interesting, and I wanted to kind of explore that. So to answer your question, do I like start with a social issue? Not typically. Usually social issues come up, or, you know, issues I end up exploring because it comes up in the research. When I sat down to be like, I want to write about these abandoned homes, how do I do that? And then I go and look as to why they're abandoned. Like, that was the story in itself.
Right. Yeah, it is a story in itself. And it's interesting because, this will date me, but I remember going to Detroit in the 90s, and I hadn't been to Detroit, and we were doing a road trip. We're doing this road trip down to the States anyway, we'll go across the bridge, and we get into Detroit, and it was after dark, and it was scary. It was scary in downtown Detroit after dark, because you're right, like everything was shuttered. There were, you know, closed bars, like metal things over all the shop windows, and you were scared. Like, we were practically scared. We don't even have White Castle here. It's a like a hamburger chain in the States, right? So we're hungry. We go into the White Castle, and we were almost scared to go from the parking lot into the White Castle. Like, we were like, oh. Little innocent Canadians, please give us the burgers. Anyway, but yeah, Detroit was pretty scary. And I wonder if 2018, maybe the subprime mortgage crisis too. That was another horrible thing that made people abandon their
Yeah.
houses too, right? And that was another, again, like.
Well, that was the interesting part, is that a lot of those homes were lost in the 2008 recession.
Yeah.
But then a lot of developers came in and bought those homes for very cheap prices. And instead of, tearing down the homes, like rebuilding the community, they left the homes looking the way they are, and they continue to leave it that way because they were just buying their time.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really, in and of itself, I think that's quite sinister, that you would leave a city looking the way it was. Because there has been some improvement since, my 2018 visit, but the fact that they're leaving the buildings the way it is, and not giving it back, and not giving back to the community, and not being a part of the community that they bought like their homes in, is terrible.
Yeah, that's an interesting theme in the book. I'm going to leave it because I don't want any spoilers. I feel like we're talking about stuff that comes up later in the book. And so let's go back to ghosts. I have to ask you the question, do you believe in ghosts?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So do you have a theory about ghosts? Like, do they come back because they have unfinished business in this world? Or do they randomly just come back because they don't want to leave things? Or do you have a theory, or you just sort of generally believe they could be there?
I just believe that spirits are called to, they're still called down to earth for different reasons. Or they may, like you said, have unfinished business, or they feel like, not vindictive, but they feel like wronged. Like, I shouldn't have to leave. Like, I was supposed to stay here. This is my house. Like, there's a lot of reasons why ghosts stay around and not move on, because of unfinished business. So 100% I believe in ghosts. I believe that there's so many places, but some places get hit differently.
Have you ever had a paranormal experience with a ghost?
Yes, I have.
Okay, are you going to tell our readers about it?
I actually did a little video about this on my Instagram page, but I could definitely tell you. So I typically like to do ghost tours in every domestic city I go to. And in fact, in 2018, it was such a quick trip that I didn't get a chance to look to see if Ottawa had a ghost like walking tour. But I did one in Toronto while we were still filming Orphan Black. So that was like kind of like, this is just my thing. So this particular time I went down to Savannah, I was doing some research on the Hag, which is something that comes up in my book. And I did this really amazing ghost tour, and the guy, so you're walking to different parts of Savannah, that's Savannah, Georgia. And our tour leader said to us, like, okay, I'm going to take you to this particular area, but, if you feel anything, we've had a lot of incidents there. If you feel anything, just let us know. And, sometimes I had never seen a ghost up until that point. So I was just kind of like, yeah, sure, guy. I thought he was just trying to like, make it really scary. And we get to this particular square, and on this tour, there was another man who was like super drunk and like kind of just being like obnoxious with his phone, saying, I'm going to catch a ghost on my phone. And we're at this area, and our tour guide was giving us a speech, and my stomach was really hurting. And I thought I just had like gas or something, because I just ate all this barbecue and I was just like kind of blowing it off. And then the guy, all of a sudden, the drunk guy says, hey, I think I got something. And he shows this photo, and it's literally a woman who is translucent in like a Victorian kind of garb, looking like right at us. And I kept like looking across, like I kept staring at the photo and looking across. I'm like, no, this is the exact same. Like, there's no way he could have like made this up. Like, there's no way. And he was with his family. Like, it wasn't like he was like a plant in this like tour, but I couldn't even get it together because my stomach was hurting. The tour guide looked at the photo and was like, yeah, we need to leave right now. So we leave and we go to maybe the next location, and the tour guide looks at me, he's like, your stomach was hurting. I mean, you felt something, wasn't you? And I realized that my stomach had stopped hurting all of a sudden, like unexplained. So that was my paranormal experience.
Wow.
That tour was incredible. I took pictures. I got a couple of like orbs because I stumbled across. So it was like double whammy of ghosts all on this one tour.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. I do also believe in ghosts, but I can't say I've ever actually encountered one. But that is pretty amazing. My mother, after her father died, said he was up in the corner. Like literally for a couple of weeks, she was like, "Yeah, he's up there. He's in the corner."
Ooh,
Yeah, I know. I know.
unsettling.
Um,
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. In your book, the ghosts are in the basement. And that's not a spoiler because you find that out very early in the book. Which is scarier, a ghost in the basement or a ghost in the attic?
I think it goes in the attic.
Yeah. Why?
I think like, because I've always thought about this, like we really use basements. Like
Yeah.
when we typically have a basement, we use it, for storage, like all or a second room, an office, like whatever the case is. But it's very rare we use the attic. And for some reason, having something above you that you're not even thinking about is very like it's unsettling.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I would have gone for the basement because the basements are always like I always think about the unfinished basement, the that's still almost like a dirt floor. I'm not thinking of the computer being this is my basement. It's very banal. It's like got this horrible paneling from the 1970s. But like I always think of the actual dripping, kind of moldy, kind of, stone and dirt floor basement. That's a very scary place to me where ghosts could definitely live. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about in the book, there is a character. So the main character, she's a teenage girl, teenage young woman. And it's very interesting. I actually thought it was really nice the way that in the book, you don't know everything about her up front. Like it sort of comes out as you go through the story, which is, it's a great way to discover the character rather than having it all up front. But I think you discover throughout the story, she does smoke marijuana. Well, she tries to. She's trying to grow the plants, but she does smoke marijuana. And I think the way I read the story, like I don't think it's encouraging people to smoke marijuana, but it's also not necessarily saying that marijuana is the worst thing in the world, and more so that it's the policies or the criminalization of it and that leading to people getting put in jail that's like almost a bigger problem than smoking marijuana. I just wondered, sometimes when you address a topic that way, you can face sort of backlash or censorship, or maybe some schools don't want you to visit or don't want you to, like, have you ever faced anything like that because of that theme in your book?
So the book came out September at this point, and I haven't faced anything yet. I think people are too distracted banning my other book to notice that there's weed in this one. Yeah, I'm going through a lot of censorship here in the States. My second book, Monday's Not Coming, has been, sort of on this critical race theory brigade is attacking it. And a lot of school districts in Texas and Utah and Virginia are, sort of have this like blacklist of books that they've been focusing on. So that's why and they're focusing on the dumbest thing that happens in the book, that, something that it's a mention of sex and not the actual act of sex. And it's a book about, missing Black girls. So, it's very clear that the parents who are, leading this charge haven't read the book. So that's what I mean by like, I think they're a little too distracted with that they haven't gotten to White Smoke enough to actually read it and then ban this one too. So I'm kind of grateful in a lot of ways. But you do bring up a really good point that, I am kind of discussing, weed and the broader scope of it, in the sense of just making sure that particularly kids know that, this is not something that's evil, that had never been evil. And, it was, I think what happened, or, particularly how it was criminalized in a lot of ways, it was used against a lot of communities. So I feel like there is such hypocrisy at the end of the day when it comes to, weed being legal in a lot of places, yet people still being in jail for the very thing that, people are now like selling and opening up whole stores for. I think, we need to have like a sit down about that, or like, at least let kids understand, the hypocrisy and the injustice of it all. So that way we can also like account for the fact that, hey, there is like a woman in jail right now for selling weed for the same thing that, someone else, maybe a white man, is selling it and has never been to jail. So I think, it just sort of highlights once again a lot of the injustice. And this
It might make sense to just give a blanket pardon, like everyone who's in jail for selling, well, maybe not if you're like, I don't know, like importing a whole bunch and selling it to little kids or something, like that should be an exception. But like anyone who's in jail just for possession, they should just get a buy, right? Like, sorry, we made a mistake. Go have your life, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I also found it was really interesting that you had this very cool character, Yusuf, right? The guy that she meets there in her new town. And they have really frank and open discussions because he's against smoking weed, but he's not seen as being like square or uncool or whatever. It's just like, this is his, he has reasons why he doesn't think it's a good idea. And she has reasons why she wants to or needs to or feels it's part of her life. And they had like a really good, frank and open discussion about it, in which at some points there's tension between them, right? But I think it's a really good way of addressing that question and getting maybe two different sides of the story out and saying, yeah, these two are both legitimate, opinions to have, and you can have a discussion about it, right?
Yeah, because I don't feel like there's a right or wrong answer to it. It is your preference. It is what, So Marigold really suffers from anxiety, and the medication that she was taking really made her groggy, and it wasn't working. And so she started, smoking marijuana. And though she shouldn't, I think there's a lot of judgment there. And so obviously I'm trying to address the judgment that is there, because obviously it's affecting her life and is actually she does better with it. In a lot of different ways. But I think, yes, I think both characters can be wrong and right at the same time. And that's actually a part of life. Like there is no like blanket answers for everything that we're going through, except for racism. I'm just gonna like throw that out.
Okay, let's just
racism is always bad. Like it's just like hard stop right there. But I think there's, if we start unpacking things and looking into the deeper levels of why people do what they do, I think we would have definitely a lot more compassion and empathy for each other than judgment.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I agree with your point about racism. Not okay. No, not okay. Can I back up to what you said about your other book? Can you tell me a little bit more about your other book? I haven't read it. It was intriguing to me. You talked about missing Black women, because I don't know if you're aware, but in Canada, murdered and missing Aboriginal women, like Indigenous girls, has been quite important in the past couple of years and everything. And it's had a lot of, more awareness raising about that. So maybe you could just tell people a little bit quickly about your other book, and also why people are banning it.
So White Smoke is about a girl named Claudia, whose best friend Monday is, I'm sorry, I said White Smoke. Monday's Not Coming is the title of the book. I don't have it with me. I'm in my new office, but Monday's Not Coming is about a girl named Claudia, whose best friend Monday is missing, and no one seems to notice until she shows up 1 year later. And it really talks about the idea of when missing Black and brown children, when children like Black and brown children go missing, they are rarely a national priority. They don't get the same sort of access and search that particularly maybe white women get. So I'm sure you all have heard about the Gabby Pinto case that happened this past summer, and this wild, frantic search for her to the point of just like nauseum. But at the same time, there were hundreds of Black girls who were missing that barely got a tweet. So I wanted to really address that and address the ideas of what happens in those sort of cases. And the way that and I wanted to talk about it, particularly a missing children's story, from the perspective of the best friend of a missing child, rather than like the parent or the grandparent, because I do feel like when people go missing, it affects everyone. It affects the mailman who's used to seeing them. It affects, neighbors. So I think that it's important to kind of like broaden the scope so people have a bit more, like I said, like my favorite word, empathy, for, and also kind of take action. And I guess the reason why this book is being banned is because there is a scene where they are talking about, oral sex. And that is literally maybe 2 or 3 pages, not even the act of it. It's just, the mentioning of it. And that is why the book is being banned. And I think it also, secretly, I also think it's the fact that I am pointing out that Black and brown children are not a national priority. They don't get Amber Alerts. They don't get, just this mass hysteria to find them. And so the idea that I'm sort of like pointing that out, I think also bothers people in a lot of ways. But that is the reason why my book, but then there's also, and what I've read from other different articles is literally some schools are banning it because another school banned it.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's been, this has been.
Are these high schools or elementary schools?
Excuse me?
The schools that are banning it, are they high schools or elementary schools?
They're middle school and high schools.
High schools. Oh,
yes.
I don't think the kids are that innocent that they don't know.
I try not to respond about it, but I really truly feel that parents think their kid, like these parents don't actually know their children. And that's the saddest part about it.
Yeah, it's sad that everyone's children except mine are into that kind of stuff, Well, we're just about ready to go to questions. It's 7:41, so we've got 3 more minutes. I've only got 2 questions here, so I want you guys out there to send us some more questions, please. Because I'm looking here and like I'm almost all out of mine, but I do have one more question for you that I wrote down, which is writing for teens, because let's just admit it, you and I aren't teens anymore. And my books were actually more like, I've written mostly middle grade. And when I think about writing for teens, I always think of middle grade as just like a happy time in your life, when reality hasn't really hit. And then when you're a teenager, all of a sudden there's all these emotions and all like everything is intense. And I found as like for myself as a writer, it's hard to go back to that. Like it's emotional. Like when you're writing something, you're digging into those emotions and they're coming up again. And it's hard going back to being a teenager and feeling all that intensity again. What is it that for you draws you to writing for the teens and about teen characters?
What's interesting is I didn't know I was going to end up here. I honestly, my first book, which does feature a teenage girl, I first started querying, and querying means when you start looking for an agent. I queried that book as a women's fiction, a women's commercials fiction for like over a year. I had no clue why it really even existed. So I think that's why I was kind of like, I'm shocked to be in this place. But I think that even though, yes, my teenage years were just an insane, crazy time. And, even my middle grade years were pretty like rough as well too. I always had a lot of questions. I had a lot of questions that were not answered. And so I had questions about, a girl who had been kidnapped in elementary school. What happened to her? I had questions about, people who lose their homes. I had questions about, girls who are being sexually assaulted and why are they being blamed as, why the victim blaming? Mm-hmm. I had questions about that, but I never got answers. So I grew up without these answers. And I think a lot of my books are answering questions that young Tiffany had. in a way that I never saw on the page. I didn't see in, media. I wanted, and I know there's so many more of me's out there. The quirky Black kid who wanted to read horror stories, but there are no Black people in horror stories, or they're always the ones who are killed in the movies. I wanted to read those things. I wanted to experience that. So I think overall, I choose to stay in this genre, or stay in this like element of young adults, because I feel like there's still like a lot of questions that, need to be answered. And there's a lot of ways that we can answer those questions and it be also helpful and a conversation starter to change the world. So I think if we give kids sort of broaden the scope of an issue in an entertaining way, if I can leave the world better for it, then yeah, I'm going to stay here for a while.
So, healing the world one horror story at a time. I like that. I do like that. I am going to go to some questions here because it is 7:45 and I did promise people that I would go to questions at 7:45. So the first question from Rocky is, I'm just going to read it. Is representation in your books important to you? Growing up, did you see people of color in stories?
So obviously representation is huge for me because I didn't grow up seeing a lot of people in stories. But also the fact that and I just want to make sure I'm clear that these stories of Black people in it, young adult stories of Black people in it, they weren't always readily available. So for instance, if I walked into, a Brooklyn Public Library, they were never front facing. They were always in the stacks, or they were like not even in the stacks. You never knew that they existed. No one would actually kind of book talk about like our books. So in a sense, yeah, I didn't know a lot of these books existed because no one was championing diverse books, because there was this assumption that Black people didn't read. And it was a trash assumption at the end of the day. It's a trash assumption. So I think that's one of the reasons why diversity and encouraging more diversity is so important to me, because and making sure that I do go out to schools. I do go out to detention centers. I do go out in different places so that kids could see my face and see that I'm an author, see that I'm alive, because a lot of times, I always thought most authors were dead of the books that I was. So see that I'm alive and thriving and doing the work that I really want to do. And so it is very purposeful when I go on school visits and trips and stuff like that, to make sure that they see an example, because I didn't have an example growing up.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And Booksy Mystique, that has got to be a pen name, but maybe not, asks, how do you get inspired to write such dark, twisty tales of wonder?
Ooh.
Yeah.
I think obviously, like I mentioned, I'm a very curious person. So if something sounds really bizarre, I literally go down a whole rabbit hole of trying to understand like what happened. So like, let's say I hear a case, or I hear of an urban legend, I will literally just take the time to just keep on going down this whole rabbit hole to figure out like, that didn't really happen, did it? Like I was the girl who spent like a week looking for Bigfoot, like trying to understand where the legend of Bigfoot came from, because I was just like, why are we so afraid of this? And like, why do we still believe this is actually a creature that exists? And just kind of going through like, and tracking like, people who have claimed to have like the corpse of Bigfoot, like, and the fact that, these called different things in different countries. And then I'm always like, how does Bigfoot, this one creature, how is he in all these different countries? Does he get on the plane? Like, there's no way he's walking. So I think that whenever I come across like a case, i.e. like maybe like the haunting that I came across for that inspired White Smoke, I go down a rabbit hole and then I'm really fascinated by it and I want to share it in a more palatable, entertaining way. And just a FYI, I'm probably never going to write about Bigfoot. That's the most frustrating thing I've ever come across. Like, it's just dumb. Like, I get angry about it.
Okay, so ghosts exist, but Bigfoot doesn't.
Absolutely not. Absolutely.
Vampires. Do vampires exist?
No,
Werewolves.
no. Even though I do feel that werewolves or wolves do have like spirits about them, because
Okay.
they definitely do like communicate. But do I believe that they like, it's like a boy who turns into a werewolf when the full moon? No.
Okay. All right, I'll get off this because we have more questions here that are better than my questions. I was just filling time there. So, okay, if you could spend a night locked in a bookstore. Oh, this is a great question. Okay, this is Rose's question. If you could spend a night locked in a bookstore with any book character, who would it be? And what would you talk about?
Any book character?
Any book character. Ooh.
Oh, this is a really good question. Because if we're locked in a bookstore, I'm ultimately going to ask that character, like, what do you want to read?
Okay.
Like, because we're locked in a bookstore, so we have nothing but time. And so I would be interested in what the character is interested in reading.
What character though? Who's your fantasy character? I mean, I'm already thinking of who it would be for me, but
who would it be for you? Who would it be for you?
It would be the Count of Monte Cristo, because I love historical fiction and he's such a romantic figure, and he escaped from the Bastille, so he would be able to escape us from the bookstore, but maybe he wouldn't want to. All right, so who's it for you?
So then in that case, I would actually be interested, and this is maybe just because I'm kind of interested in talking to Edward Cullen from Twilight. And mostly because I just want to ask like some clarifying questions about, who he is and why he did what he did, and, those type of things. And also just curious if he knows how much he has affected the genre of YA.
Oh.
Like, do you know that Twilight kind of turned the tables for a lot of different people, like changed authors' lives just in general? Like, do you know what you've done? Like,
that's incredible. You would ask a fictional character a meta-fictional question.
yes.
I love that. That's brilliant. Yeah.
And that way, we're in a bookstore, so I can show him all these books that literally was like the inspiration, or wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for you.
True.
So I think that I would be fascinated by what he liked to read. Does he see himself in other books? Like, does he see himself in because he was such an inspiration that even fan fiction, I'm curious, do you know there's whole fan fictions on Wattpad about you? A whole different universe you live in? I'm just curious what do you know what you've done?
That is a really good question. Do you buy the theory that the reason Twilight became so big was because the kids who grew up reading Harry Potter hit adolescence and wanted an adolescent, a fantasy book that was for them as adolescents, not as little kids?
I mean, yes, in some ways, yes, because I remember Harry Potter sort of there was a little slight overlap.
Yeah.
But I also believe that it was an addictive story. I think it was an addictive story that, sort of hit because, I think vampire resurgence comes every couple of years.
Yeah.
There was a time where everyone was obsessed with Interview with the Vampire.
Yeah.
And then we went to something else. And then we went to something else. So, we're about due for a new one soon.
More vampires.
Yeah.
They don't exist, but we want them anyway.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. This is a question from Julia Albert. How does an interesting story or urban legend that you hear evolve from an idea to making it into your own story? So you've kind of touched on that, but maybe go in a bit more depth on that. How do you make it your own? Yeah.
How do,
So you hear the story, like the haunting, let's say the haunting in Japan, right? So you hear
Yeah.
about that haunting, but okay, so great, that's a haunting and you've gone down the rabbit hole and you found out about it. How do you make it your own story?
I typically, because a lot of things inspire me, I typically try to bring it, whatever story or case or anything I hear, I try to put myself in it, like, and bring it to like my city, i.e. like Brooklyn or New York, or, you know, whatever the city that I'm in, or make up a fictional city like I did in White Smoke. I try to bring it to a more, I guess, a reachable place, I suppose, especially, and also I try to think about that story from a kid's perspective. Because, you know, there's bad things that happen in the world and we never and we assume that we need to like shelter kids from it. And oftentimes that kid already knows, or knows what's happening, but doesn't have sort of like the language to talk about it or know the exact reasoning behind it. So I think that I try to break down, every single part of an issue that I'm attacking, or, issue that's happening in a case, and sort of lay it all out for children to understand. Because sometimes if we don't have the full scope of a problem, we digest it differently. So I tend to look at oftentimes a lot of people put my books in like the social justice category, and which, that's fine, but oftentimes I'm only attacking like a slice of that. Like in White Smoke, I'm discussing gentrification, but that's only just a tip of the iceberg of everything else that's happening. So I think if we just do things in small pieces, you can truly understand what is actually happening in our society.
That's an interesting point. And it's interesting. I'm just going to talk about this because we don't have any more questions. So if anyone has a question, please put it in there. But I found the story was interesting, White Smoke, just going back to that, when you talk about children, because there's there's the adolescent character who's Marigold, but there's two child characters, right? Who is Piper, the stepsister, and then Sammy, who's the little brother. And it's very interesting the way that Marigold is almost a bridge. Well, first of all, because she has a good relationship with Sammy. So she's sort of a bridge between the adult world and Sammy's child world. And he does turn out to understand a whole heck of a lot more than anyone is giving him credit for. And then in the end, I don't want to spoil it, but she does improve her relationship with Piper. And you see that Piper also maybe understands, or maybe not intellectually understands, but some part of her understands a lot of what's going on kind of intuitively. And people don't give her credit for that either. Right. And so I found it was really interesting the way you let those child characters also come through in the book.
Yeah, I think oftentimes people, and I say this a lot, people grossly underestimate what children can handle, and not allowing children to sort of be their full selves because they want them to be like these small people. But it's also very interesting when you experience a child who's, able to be themselves. And so I really wanted to kind of see that, particularly with Sammy, because I love smart kids. Like, I love smart ass kids, but I also love super smart kids.
Yeah. And do you think Sammy, is he the smart ass kid or the super smart kid?
I think he's kind of both. I think he has both of that in him, definitely.
Yeah. It's a nice relationship between the siblings that you definitely build. I really enjoyed that part of the book. Well, it is 7:58. So if anyone has a question, this is your last chance. I am going to remind everybody that the Ottawa Storytellers will be presenting the Children's Storytelling Festival, free and online. It's 6 full days of tales from November 22nd to 27th. Tales and rhymes for all ages. For little ones, stories full of twists and turns. For older ones, and beautiful traditional tales told by Indigenous tellers in French and en français and in English. And I don't know if in Cree or Ojibwe, maybe not, but who knows, maybe soon, maybe someday. So yeah, it's 7:59. I don't see any more questions. Oh, quickly one. Would you ever consider writing a fairy tale retelling?
Oh, maybe it depends on the fairy tale. I don't know what I would do. There's so many, but yeah, maybe I would try it. I would definitely try it.
All
But
right.
thank you so much for this. This was really fun.
Thank you, Tiffany. I really enjoyed speaking with you. And maybe next time you'll be able to get up to Ottawa for real. I don't know if we,
Yes.
do we throw back to our host here at the library, or am I just signing off? I think I'm signing off. It feels like a big responsibility to say goodbye to you, Tiffany. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for sharing your insights. I'm sure you've inspired a lot of readers and maybe potential writers out there. So we'll hope to see you in Ottawa sometime.
Hopefully soon. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you. Goodbye,
Bye.
everyone.